places in this world that aren't meant to be found. Places where the rules of reality unravel and the familiar turns into the terrifying. Tonight, we'll journey deep into the unknown, where eerie whispers call your name from darkened woods. Ghostly figures haunt deserted roads, and flickering lanterns lead you deeper into danger. These 5 chilling campfire stories are not just tales to keep you awake at night. They are warnings. Each one will pull you further into a world where fear becomes your only companion and survival is never guaranteed. As you listen, ask yourself this: would you have made it out alive? Story 1. The Whispering Woods. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was just the wind. But wind doesn't know your name. I had been planning this camping trip for months. Work was suffocating, and the idea of a solo adventure deep in the wilderness was the only thing that kept me going. When I mentioned my destination, a secluded, unmarked trail known as Black Hollow, to the locals in town, their reactions were unsettling. A few laughed nervously, dismissing the idea with a shake of their heads. Others grew serious, warning me about strange sounds that people claim to hear at night. Stay on the main trails, one elderly shopkeeper urged me, her voice firm. People wander off into Black Hollow and don't come back the same, if they come back at all. I waved it off. Superstitions, I thought. Every small town has its legends, and I wasn't about to let ghost stories ruin my escape. The first day went smoothly. The air was crisp and the forest stretched endlessly around me, its canopy casting dancing shadows on the trail. By sunset, I'd pitched my tent in a small clearing near a creek, the soft, gurgling water a comforting backdrop. I ate, read a few pages of a dog-eared book, and watched the stars emerge. Then came the first whisper. At first, I thought it was the rustle of leaves, or maybe the wind catching in the branches above. But as I strained to listen, it became clear. Words, faint and indistinct, carried on the breeze. I stepped out of my tent and scanned the woods with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just the silent expanse of trees. By morning, I had convinced myself it was my imagination. Spending the night alone in the wilderness could do that to anyone, right? I packed up and decided to explore deeper into Black Hollow. The second night, the whispers came back. This time, they were louder. I had set up camp near a fallen log surrounded by mossy stones. After dinner, I lay in my tent, trying to relax. The faint murmur began again, rising and falling like an incomprehensible chant. It was closer now, more distinct. And then I heard it, my name. At first, I thought I must have misheard, but then it came again. Soft, drawn out, and unmistakable. Michael? I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent and shone the beam into the trees. Hello? My voice cracked, breaking the silence. No response. But as I turned, the light caught something on a nearby tree. A symbol etched into the bark, one I hadn't noticed before. It was crude, like it had been carved in haste, but its shape was unsettling. A jagged circle with strange intersecting lines through it. I didn't sleep that night. By the third day, I was exhausted but stubborn. I wasn't about to let some creepy sounds and graffiti scare me off. I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, hoping to find some landmark or clearing to distract me from my growing unease. That's when I found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least it had been. The body was twisted unnaturally, its neck bent at an impossible angle, eyes wide and clouded. Surrounding it were small stones arranged in a precise circle, each one marked with the same symbol I'd seen on the tree. The whispers started again that evening, before the sun had even set. They were no longer faint. They were insistent, pressing into my ears even when I covered them. And then I saw them. Shadows. They flickered just beyond the firelight, darting between the trees. At first, I thought it was animals, maybe coyotes, but these shapes were wrong. They moved upright, their forms unnaturally elongated, limbs too long for their bodies. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. Desperate to understand what was happening, I decided to follow the whispers. Part of me hoped it would lead to an answer, while the other part hoped it was all in my head. The forest grew darker as I walked, my flashlight struggling to cut through the oppressive gloom. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a clearing. The sight stopped me in my tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of figures, their faces obscured by dark hoods. They swayed as they chanted, their voices blending into the same whispers that had plagued me. The symbols I'd seen carved into the trees were drawn in the dirt around them, glowing faintly in the firelight of a single flame. My breath caught as I realized one of the figures was holding something, a bundle wrapped in cloth. It writhed unnaturally, and the muffled sound of movement escaped from it. I must have stepped on a branch because the sound of its snapping echoed like a gunshot. The chanting stopped. Slowly, the figures turned to face me. For a moment, the clearing was deathly silent. Then one of them raised a hand and pointed in my direction. I ran. The forest seemed alive as I sprinted through it, branches clawing at my face and legs, the whispers now screaming in my ears. Behind me, I could hear them following, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, and heavy breaths. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached my camp, I grabbed my backpack and ran. I left the tent, the fire, everything. The whispers followed me all the way back to the edge of the woods, fading only when I emerged onto the main trail. It wasn't until I was safe at home that I realized something was wrong. I'd been too terrified to notice it in the moment, but as I unpacked my bag, I saw it. One of the symbols carved into the fabric of my tent, as if left there as a warning or a promise. I've never returned to Black Hollow. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear my name being whispered. Michael. Story 2. The Phantom Camper. I thought I was alone by the fire until I heard the faint crackle of a second campfire just beyond the trees. Camping alone had always been my favorite escape. There was something about the quiet isolation of the wilderness that felt like a reset button for my mind. That's why I found myself in the middle of the Ozark National Forest, one cool autumn evening, miles from civilization. The trip was supposed to be uneventful, a few days of hiking, reading, and just enjoying the solitude. But what started as a peaceful retreat quickly turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. After setting up camp, I sat by my fire, letting the warmth soak into my skin as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest came alive with the sounds of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the hoot of a distant owl. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a second campfire crackling somewhere nearby. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I hadn't seen a single person all day, and this part of the forest wasn't exactly popular with hikers. But the sound was clear, a gentle popping and hissing, just like the fire at my feet. I stood up, scanning the surrounding trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the still night air. No answer. The crackling stopped. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a branch snapping or the wind carrying the sound of my own fire. But as I crawled into my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. The next day, I explored deeper into the forest, leaving my campsite set up for when I returned. The trails were beautiful, lined with fiery orange and red leaves, but I couldn't fully enjoy them. The memory of the phantom fire lingered in the back of my mind. When I returned to camp that evening, the woods felt off. The usual sounds of nature were quieter, like the forest was holding its breath. After dinner, I sat by the fire again, trying to shake the unease. That's when I noticed it. Beyond the glow of my campfire, deep in the shadows, something moved. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion, but enough to send a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I called, grabbing my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I retreated to my tent early that night, zipping it up tightly and keeping my flashlight within arm's reach. I woke up at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of faint laughter. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, just audible enough to set my heart racing. It wasn't the joyous kind of laughter you'd expect from a group of campers. It was hollow, almost mocking, and it came from the direction of the second campfire I'd imagined the night before. By morning, I was determined to find out what was going on. I wasn't sure if it was some prankster messing with me or something else entirely, but I needed answers. I ventured toward the direction of the laughter. About 100 yards from my camp, I found it, a fire pit. The ashes were cold, but the stones around it were blackened, as if it had been used recently. Scattered around the site were the remnants of a meal, a tin can, a charred piece of wood, and something that made my stomach turn, a single, muddy boot. It was old and weathered, with cracks in the leather and the laces frayed. But the unsettling part was the size. It was small, almost childlike. There were no signs of anyone else nearby, no footprints, no gear, nothing. Just that lonely boot and the cold fire pit. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept my fire burning brighter than usual, adding logs until the flames danced high into the air. The woods were eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, there he was, a man sitting cross-legged by a fire that hadn't been there moments before. His fire was faint, barely more than embers, but it cast just enough light to see his silhouette. He sat motionless, his head tilted slightly as if listening. I froze. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Who are you?" He didn't respond. He didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in his direction. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The fire, the man. They were gone, but the laughter returned. It echoed around me, bouncing off the trees, coming from every direction at once. I stumbled back into my tent, zipping it up as fast as I could. I barely slept that night, clutching my flashlight and knife, waiting for the dawn. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed up my gear in record time, constantly glancing over my shoulder. But as I started hiking back toward the main trail, I realized something terrifying. I was lost. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't find the path. Landmarks I was sure I'd passed before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself. As the day wore on, I grew more desperate. My water was running low and my nerves were frayed. That's when I saw it again, the fire pit. This time, it was burning. A figure stood beside it, facing away from me. It was the man I'd seen the night before. Slowly, he turned to face me. His features were indistinct, like a face half-formed out of smoke, but his eyes, they were black voids, like pits that led to nothingness. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots. But when I looked up, he was gone. I don't know how I found my way back to my campsite, but when I did, I realized I had no choice but to spend one more night in the forest. It was too late to keep searching for the trail, and darkness was already falling. That night, the laughter was constant. It circled my camp, growing louder and closer as the hours dragged on. Shadows flickered just outside the firelight, shapes too large and too strange to be animals. Around midnight, my fire suddenly went out. Panic set in as I scrambled to relight it, but my lighter wouldn't spark. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, and I felt something, someone standing right behind me. I didn't look. I couldn't. I grabbed my backpack and ran, using the dim glow of my dying flashlight to guide me. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, the sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the trailhead. I collapsed onto the ground, shaking and exhausted. I never found out who or what that man was or why he seemed to haunt the woods. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. Sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint crackle of a campfire and the sound of hollow laughter. Story 3. The Cabin That Wasn't There. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd never believe a cabin could disappear in the blink of an eye. I wasn't supposed to be hiking that far off the trail. It was late in the season, and the weather was already turning cold. Most people had packed away their gear for the year, leaving the forest eerily quiet. But I wanted to escape, away from work, from people, from everything. So I ignored the posted signs and ventured deeper into the woods, onto an unmarked path I'd heard about online. I told myself I'd only be out for a few hours, but when the clouds rolled in and the sun dipped lower than I expected, I realized I'd misjudged the time. I was lost. By the time I admitted it to myself, I was cold, hungry, and starting to panic. I hadn't seen a trail marker or a sign of civilization for hours. My phone had no signal and the battery was nearly dead. And then, just as the first drops of rain began to fall, I saw it, a cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its weathered wood blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a faint golden glow seeped through the windows. It was as if the cabin had been waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment. Something about the sight felt wrong. The cabin was too perfect, too convenient, but the cold was biting now, and the rain was picking up. I convinced myself I was just overthinking it and approached the door. When I knocked, the sound echoed dully. No one answered. I tried the handle. It turned easily, the door creaking open to reveal a cozy interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a neatly made bed in the corner, and a single oil lamp glowing softly on the mantel. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the heavy silence. No response. It felt wrong to barge in, but the weather was worsening and I had no other option. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The cabin seemed frozen in time. The furniture was old but well maintained, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore. On the table sat a cup of tea, long gone cold, and a book with yellowed pages left open, as if the owner had stepped out for just a moment. But where were they? As the hours passed, I grew uneasy. The fire burned steadily, but I hadn't added a single log. The lamp never dimmed, though I couldn't find any source of fuel. And the silence, it wasn't natural. No wind, no rain on the roof, no creaks of settling wood, just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. That's when I noticed the rocking chair. It sat near the fireplace, empty and still. But now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw it move. Just a slight shift, as if someone had pushed it gently. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, but as the night went on, the movement became more pronounced. By midnight, the chair was rocking steadily back and forth, though there was no one in it. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was determined to leave. Whatever comfort the cabin had offered was gone, replaced by an oppressive unease that gnawed at me. But when I stepped outside, the world was different. The clearing was gone. The trees pressed in closer than I remembered, their gnarled branches arching overhead like skeletal hands. The trail I'd followed to the cabin had vanished, replaced by dense undergrowth. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart sinking. That's when I saw the symbols. They were carved into the wooden door frame, intricate looping patterns that hadn't been there the night before. They looked ancient, almost alive, as if they'd been burned into the wood by something not entirely human. Against my better judgment, I stepped back inside. The cabin was darker now, the fire burned low, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was pressing down on the roof. The rocking chair was still. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined everything from the night before, but then I noticed the book on the table. It wasn't open to the same page anymore. I tried to leave again that afternoon, hacking my way through the dense undergrowth in a desperate attempt to find the trail. But no matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the cabin. It was as if the forest itself was working against me, herding me back to that cursed place. That night, the voices started. I was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard them. Faint whispers just on the edge of hearing, coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, the whispers became clearer. Words fragmented and overlapping, spoken in a language I didn't recognize. I sat up, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. The shadows cast by the fire seemed deeper now, almost alive. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. Leave. The word was sharp, clear, and unmistakable. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Leave. It came again, louder this time. I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing my backpack, I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, the intricate symbols glowing faintly in the firelight. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, though I knew no one would hear me. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, echoing in my head. And then, as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The cabin fell silent. I turned to face the room, and that's when I saw it. The rocking chair was moving again, back and forth, faster and faster, and then it stopped. The door creaked open behind me, letting in a cold gust of air that extinguished the fire. I didn't think. I ran. The clearing was gone, replaced by a dense, foggy forest. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at my arms and legs. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I broke through the trees and onto a dirt road. My relief was short-lived. I looked back, and the cabin was there, standing at the edge of the woods, though I was certain I'd run miles. When I finally made it home, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a stress-induced nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But a week later, I found something in my bag that made my blood run cold. The book. It was the same one from the cabin, its yellowed pages filled with the strange, looping symbols I'd seen carved into the doorframe. I burned it immediately. I've told myself I'll never go back into the woods, but sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I can still hear the whispers and the faint creak of a rocking chair. Story 4. The Lantern in the Fog. The fog was so thick I couldn't see my own hands, but the lantern was always there, glowing faintly. It started as a simple evening hike. The woods behind my house stretched for miles, and I knew the trails well, or so I thought. I'd walked them dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, and they always felt safe, familiar. That night, though, something was different. The fog rolled in suddenly, thick and clinging, turning the familiar forest into an alien landscape. The trees, usually towering and majestic, became looming shadows, their shapes distorted and strange. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the trail disappearing into the pale gray void. I was lost. I told myself not to panic. The trail couldn't have vanished, it was just the fog playing tricks on me. I pulled out my phone, but the signal was non-existent, and my flashlight barely pierced the dense mist. That's when I saw it. A faint glow, distant but unmistakable, flickering through the fog like a candle in the dark. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, someone who could help me find my way back. Relief washed over me, and I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The light swayed slightly as if carried by a gentle hand, but it didn't come closer. I started walking toward it. The fog seemed to shift as I moved, thickening and thinning in patches, but the lantern remained just out of reach. No matter how fast I walked, it stayed the same distance ahead, its glow steady and inviting. I should have turned back. I should have trusted the knot of unease forming in my stomach, but the thought of being alone in that endless fog was worse. As I followed the lantern, the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping crickets faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the damp earth. And then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps, but as I walked, they grew louder. Indistinct murmurs, overlapping and chaotic, coming from every direction. I froze, straining to hear. The voices didn't form words, just an eerie, rhythmic cadence that made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was complete, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the forest. Then, just as I turned to leave, a single word rang out clear and sharp. "Stay." The lantern moved again, its light flickering like a beckoning hand. Against every instinct, I followed it, the whispers starting up once more. After what felt like hours, the fog thinned slightly, revealing a small clearing. At the center stood an old, rusted lamppost, leaning at an odd angle. The lantern hung from its hook, swinging gently despite the still air. The sight was impossible. There was no lamppost in these woods. I'd hiked this area for years. I would have known if it was there. I stepped into the clearing cautiously, my breath coming in short gasps. The air here was colder, biting into my skin. The ground beneath the lamppost was bare, the grass scorched black in a perfect circle around it. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, forming a dissonant chorus that seemed to vibrate in my skull. My heart pounded as I reached out to touch the lantern. "Don't!" The voice was behind me. I spun around, nearly dropping my flashlight. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the fog. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were dark, too dark, like deep pools that reflected no light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I got lost," I stammered. "I saw the lantern and thought—" "The lantern doesn't lead you out," he interrupted, stepping closer. "It leads you in." I backed away instinctively, my foot brushing against the scorched ground beneath the lamppost. His gaze dropped to the circle and his expression hardened. "Don't step in the ring," he said sharply. "Whatever you do, don't touch it." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "What is this place?" I managed to ask after a moment. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the fog. "It's a trap," he said finally. "It's how they find you." "They?" Before he could answer, the whispers returned, louder than ever, the voices rising into a fevered pitch. The fog around the clearing began to swirl, coalescing into shapes. Tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces. They moved unnaturally, their bodies jerking as if they were marionettes controlled by unseen strings. The man grabbed my arm, his grip cold and unyielding. "Run," he said. I didn't need to be told twice. We plunged into the fog, the figures closing in behind us. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to make the shadows darker. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices screaming words I couldn't understand. "Keep moving," the man shouted. "Don't stop." I stumbled over roots and rocks, my lungs burning as I struggled to keep up. The figures seemed to melt in and out of the fog, always just a step behind us. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, the man stopped abruptly, pulling me back. In front of us was a narrow wooden bridge, stretching over a dark, swirling river that hadn't been there before. The fog clung to the water, hiding whatever lay beneath. "This is the only way out," the man said, his voice grim. "But you have to cross it alone." "What? Why?" "They can't follow you on the bridge," he explained, "but they can follow me." I looked back at the shifting shapes in the fog, their hollow faces watching us intently. "What happens if they catch me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The man's expression darkened. "You won't come back." He gave me a shove toward the bridge. "Go." I stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaking ominously under my weight. The river below seemed alive, its dark surface rippling as if something was moving beneath it. The whispers grew louder, almost desperate now. The figures gathered at the edge of the fog, their forms stretching unnaturally as they reached for me. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs shaking with each step. The bridge seemed endless, stretching far longer than it should have. Halfway across, the whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then I heard it, the sound of splintering wood. I looked down and saw the boards behind me breaking apart, one by one, as if something invisible was chasing me. I ran. When I finally reached the other side, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The fog began to lift, revealing the familiar trailhead I'd started from. The man was gone. The figures were gone. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. The lantern. It was hanging from a tree branch, its light flickering faintly in the distance. I didn't wait to see what it meant. I've never been back to those woods. I've tried to tell myself it was all a hallucination, a trick of the fog and my own panicked mind. But sometimes late at night, I see a faint glow through my bedroom window, swaying gently in the dark. Story 5. The Hitchhiker's Warning. "Don't go that way," the hitchhiker said. "You won't make it out alive." It started as a simple road trip, just me, my beat-up Honda, and the endless stretch of highway. I had always loved driving at night. There was something calming about the empty roads, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just me and the faint glow of my headlights. That night was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. I was driving through a rural area in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. The radio had long since fizzled out, leaving only static, so I drove in silence, the hum of the engine my only companion. Then I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in the universal gesture for a hitchhiker. I don't usually pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of the night. But something about this man made me pause. Maybe it was the way he stood there, perfectly still, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the moon. Or maybe it was the look on his face, a mix of desperation and something else I couldn't quite place. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, slamming the door shut and sinking into the seat. His clothes were worn and dirty, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. He didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just up the road," he said, his voice low and rough. "If that's all right?" "Sure," I replied, putting the car back in gear. For a while, we drove in silence. He didn't offer any small talk, and I didn't push. There was something about him that made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Then he spoke. "Don't go past the old bridge," he said abruptly. I glanced at him, confused. "What bridge?" "You'll see it," he replied, his tone flat. "Just don't cross it. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, turn around and go back." I frowned, trying to read his expression. His eyes were still fixed on the road, his jaw tight. "Why?" I asked. "Because if you do," he said, finally turning to look at me, "you won't come back." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking or trying to scare me. His face didn't change. "I'm serious," he said. "Promise me you'll turn around." "Okay," I said, humoring him. I promise." He didn't respond. We drove for another 10 minutes before he asked me to stop. I pulled over and he got out without a word. Before closing the door, he leaned back in and said one last thing. "They don't like it when you break the rules." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness as if he'd never been there. I should have turned around right then. But curiosity got the better of me. What was so dangerous about this bridge? Why was he so insistent? I kept driving, the road growing narrower and more uneven as I went. The trees on either side of the highway seemed to press closer, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. And then I saw it, the bridge. It was old, its wooden planks warped and weathered with age. The guardrails were rusted, barely holding together, and the water below was dark and still, reflecting nothing. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating the rickety structure. For a moment I thought about turning back, but something about the bridge drew me in, like an invisible thread pulling me forward. I stepped on the gas and crossed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The hum of the engine seemed muffled, the tires on the asphalt too quiet. Even the sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves, had vanished. Then I saw the shadow. It appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman. She was standing perfectly still, her face obscured by long, dark hair that hung down to her shoulders. She wore a tattered dress, and her bare feet were planted firmly on the asphalt. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just a few feet away. "Are you okay?" I called, rolling down the window. She didn't respond. I leaned over and squinted, trying to get a better look. That's when I saw her face, or rather, the lack of one. Her skin was smooth and featureless, like a mannequin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank slate. My heart stopped. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away. But she didn't move. She just stood there, her head tilting slightly as if watching me. Though how she could watch without eyes, I didn't know. I spun the wheel, trying to turn the car around, but the road seemed narrower now, the trees pressing in on either side. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror and froze. More figures were emerging from the woods, their pale, featureless faces glowing faintly in the dark. They moved slowly at first, their heads twitching unnaturally, but as I watched, they began to pick up speed. I hit the gas. The car jolted forward, the engine roaring as I sped down the road. The figures gave chase, their movements impossibly fast, their limbs jerking and bending in ways that made my stomach turn. No matter how fast I drove, they kept pace, their blank faces haunting me in the mirror. The road seemed endless, stretching out into the dark with no end in sight. I was sure I'd driven farther than I should have, but the bridge was nowhere to be seen. Then, just as I was starting to lose hope, it appeared. The old bridge loomed ahead, its wooden planks glowing faintly in my headlights. The figures were closing in, their growls filling the air. I didn't have a choice. I hit the bridge at full speed, the car rattling as the planks creaked and groaned under the weight. For a moment, I thought the whole thing would collapse, but then I was across. The moment I reached the other side, the sounds stopped. The growls, the whispers, the creaking wood, all of it vanished. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. When I looked back, the bridge was gone. There was no sign of the figures, no sign of the woman, nothing. Just an empty road stretching into the night. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed on that side of the bridge, and I don't want to find out. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I hear a faint growl outside my window, and the whisper of a warning I didn't heed.